Okay, in this lesson we're going to be exploring an idea called the square of the pawn. Now, the chessboard is a square itself, and it's made up of 64 smaller squares. But there's another way of counting squares where there are actually 204 squares on the chessboard. That sounds a little strange at first, but let's take a look at the squares A1, A2, B2, and B1. Those 4 squares make a square. There are actually 49 of those on the chessboard. Let's look at the square going from A1 to A3 to C3 to C1. That's a square of 9 squares, and there are 36 of those. And you can see where this is going. There are a lot of squares on the chessboard. And the idea behind the square of the pawn is we're going to make a square where the pawn is on one corner of the board, and the square that we're going to make has one side where you go from the pawn to the edge of the board as one side. In this case, it's 5 squares. Then we can go across 5 squares and down 5 squares and back across 5 squares. And then we can see, is the king in the square? Now that's the easy way to do it. And we're going to look at that in a little more detail in just a moment. The slow way to do it is say, okay, the white pawn needs 4 moves to get to A8. The black king needs 4 moves to get to A8. This game should be a draw. Let's look at the square. Sure enough, the king is in the square. The rule of the square of the pawn is if the king can get in the square, it can catch the pawn if the friendly king is too far away to help out. And in this case, our friendly king is way down there on H1. He's going to be of no help at all. Now, we can make a square. There's an even faster way to do this. And that is to start with the pawn, draw a diagonal to the edge of the board on the same side that the enemy king is on, come back up to the level of the pawn, and then go back across to the pawn. So you can see that the king is still in that square. Let's look at